So hi, and today I'm speaking to the lovely Hayley, who is the head of operations. Is that right, for Paths to Parenthood?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for chatting to me today. I wanted to chat to you today because you've obviously had your own personal experience of going through treatment and going through the donor process, but also because of the work you do. So I thought it'd be really good if we could chat about your own personal journey, but then also how you now help people and the work you're doing at Paths to Parenthood to support people who are going through their own journey to hopeful parenthood as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, Sarah. So I'll try and be as brief as I can because it's obviously over several years, but I'm Hayley King and I'm based in South Wales. So I'm married to my lovely wife. We've been together for 16 years now and counting. And we have two beautiful children, twins, through donor sperm IVF, and we were successful in having them in 2017. My wife carried the pregnancy, and we also used her eggs, and we used donor sperm to conceive our children. We used a local clinic close to us in South Wales just because they were nearby. We didn't really do much research, if I'm honest, back then. And like I say, we've just raising our children in today's world. There's lots of questions around our families, I suppose, that we get from other people, but also how we talk to our children about their conception story. So, and a little twist, I suppose, to my situation is, as well as having donor conceived children, I'm actually conceived via donation as well. So my parents had me back in the very early 80s, again, thanks to donor sperm IVF. And I came into this world, like I say, a few years ago in the fertility space, talking about being on both sides of the fence, as it were. So that's kind of a little bit about me. And yeah, thanks, Sarah. You mentioned Paths to Parenthood. So a few years ago, I joined forces with the lovely Becky Kearns, who is a mum through egg donation, who founded the online support platform Paths to Parenthood. And we support parents that are either considering donation or actually parenting donor conceived kids. So that's kind of, yeah, shortish summary of where we're at there.
But it's brilliant because you have so much experience. The work you're doing now to support people is so great, and it comes a lot, I guess, from your own personal experience of going through that treatment process and going through the donor process, but also the fact you are donor conceived yourself as well, so you can come at it from both sides. And how did you find the process? I know you said you went to a local clinic, but how did you find the process in general, you know, in terms of starting the process, you know, were there challenges you faced, and how did you cope with all of that when you were going through it?
Yeah, I mean, we, like I said, my wife and I have been together some time before we looked at how we were going to build our family. And my wife is a little bit older than myself. And when we were both looking at that, at our options, my wife was approaching 40. So obviously we had those sort of concerns. We thought, right, we'll just go along and have some fertility tests done just to find out where we're at, which is what we did. And my wife had always wanted to carry a pregnancy. And to be honest, reciprocal IVF wasn't really discussed back 10 years ago. I know that sounds a bit crazy because it's quite a common way that LGBTQ couples build their families these days, but it was not even raised as an option for us. And because we were funding the treatment ourselves, because again, we weren't eligible for any NHS treatment in our local authority back then. I still don't think it's very good. So we were just looking at our options. So yeah, we just went along to our local clinic. We found it very daunting and very heteronormative, if I'm honest. It was very geared towards couples with infertility, male-female couples. So we did feel a bit like we were a square peg in a round hole, I think is the term. And yeah, we found that a lot of the conversations we had with clinic staff, whilst they were lovely and very supportive, the conversations that we were having weren't really geared towards a two-mum family to be and some of those fertility choices. So I would say that was the big first thing that we noticed. And now working in this space, I know how important feeling included and inclusive language and things like that can be. So that was probably the first thing and the first hurdle that we came across, really, Sarah. Yeah.
Yeah, and sadly, I don't think that has changed. It's something I was speaking to a clinic about the other day, about how important it is. Even things like the forms aren't, like you say, aren't relevant. You know, it mentions mum or mother and father, but it doesn't allow space for if you're not in the typical heterosexual couple going through treatment. And like you say, it can make you feel like you're not included in the treatment process. And there's so many different routes to having a child now, and so many different family setups. You want to know that people are included, and I think it's important for people to understand that might be a bit of a challenge, and how to kind of get around that, really. And is it something you raised with the clinic when you were going through it?
No, to be honest, we kind of just went through the motions with them. I think, like, even looking back, just basic conversations around. So I think they were very focused on, so my wife, we were said, right, she's going to carry the pregnancy and use her eggs, which would have been the most straightforward way with donor sperm. And because of her age, I think they were very focused on her age, but actually not really looked at the fact that she'd never had a tested fertility, because she'd never been in a straight relationship. She'd never tried to have, a family with anybody else. So it was like, and her AMH was actually quite low when we did some test results. So instead of actually saying, well, we could try IUI or whatever, it was, we're going to have to go to IVF. And that was kind of, it actually turned out fine. And we were, blessed with our twins. But I think actually, it was not even really considered. And I think they were viewing it through the lens of a woman approaching, late 30s, but almost not really seeing it as someone with untested fertility, because we were in a gay relationship. So that was quite a big one. But in terms of and they're very supportive. The nurses and everything were lovely, and so were the consultants. But looking back, they weren't very queer friendly, I don't think, really, or maybe just weren't that familiar with same-sex couples coming through the clinic back, because it was, say, over 10 years ago now.
Yeah. And do you find when you speak to people now that has improved? I know I still hear comments about it, and I don't think it's improved enough, but do you think there is more acceptance and inclusion now in clinics than you found?
I think so. I think they've had to, if I'm being blunt, because certainly when it comes to donor conception, because if you look at the statistics from the HFEA, the vast majority of cases using, say, donor sperm, and the increasing levels are from solo intended parents using donor sperm, and from the LGBTQ plus community. So I think they've kind of had to adapt, otherwise they're going to lose patients potentially. But I do think there are many clinics out there that are doing they're putting in the work, they're speaking to professionals and those with lived experience of working with our communities to kind of improve that service for their patients. But there's certainly a lot of work to be done, but I do think thankfully it's improved.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good to know. And in terms of the donor process, then, how did you find that when you were going through it? Did you have much support? Did you find it quite easy to go through? What was your...
So we only had some very basic conversations. There was actually a nurse, we called her the sperm nurse, and I think that's what she called her, which was quite funny. And she kind of facilitated the process, was able to explain to us that the sperm banks that were on, the choice of sperm banks, because we didn't know. And this is one of the things I think when I work with people now that are going through the process, sometimes one of the biggest decisions you'll make if you're using a donor is where the donor's from, whether you're using a donor bank or someone that's known to you. And sometimes if you'll pick a clinic without actually finding out what donors are available at that clinic, because a number of clinics only partner with certain sperm and egg banks. So you may have done all your initial tests and everything and started the process financially and emotionally invested and everything, and got to know the staff, and then suddenly realized actually they only work maybe with one sperm bank or one egg bank. And that was the situation with my wife and I. So when we went through the process, we only had quite a limited choice in the sperm bank that we could use, because that was the only sperm bank that our clinic partnered with at the time. So that was a bit challenging, but we were still, like I say, able to they linked us up with the website, and you could go and look at the donor profiles and make a choice from there. But it was quite challenging and kind of drawn out, that process, and we didn't have any support in it really. We were kind of just left, go away, look at this website, make your choice, tell us what it is, and then we'll deal with the rest. There was no emotional support or anything like that.
So did you have to speak to a counsellor when you were going through kind of the implications counselling? Was that kind of separate then, but still you were just told to go away? There wasn't any kind of helping? I know they can't help in the decision making, but there was no real support then in making the decision.
Yeah, so the HFEA at any clinic have to, by law, offer counselling. So it's not mandatory. In our clinic, we were offered it. And again, it was done by one of the nurses, and her response to us is, "Oh, you're donor conceived, so actually, I don't really need to speak to you about anything because you know it all," which was a bit weird. Like at the time, was quite strange. And that's all we had. And looking back again, knowing what I know now, we should have been offered a lot more support or signposting and things like that, and we weren't. So that kind of was that's all we were offered. But I do know that there are lots of clinics out there doing things a lot better. They offer maybe more than one counselling session. Some offer unlimited, included counselling, because depending on where people are coming from, using a donor can be a really emotionally challenging process, and a lot of people do need that professional support. So yeah, like I say, again, if people are looking at their options, it's always worth finding out what counselling is available and what's included.
Yeah, definitely, because I think it's so important. When I speak to a lot of people who are using a donor, they've often said that they haven't always found it helpful because there's so much emphasis put on the implication side of it, telling any child they potentially have, or whether they tell them or not they were donor conceived, and not as much focus as needed in kind of coming to terms with the fact they need to use a donor and grieving the fact the child won't be biologically theirs. And they often feel like there's a bit of that gap. And do you think there was a difference because you were in a same-sex couple using donor sperm rather than it being donor sperm being used in a heterosexual couple where obviously they're grieving the fact that the male partner wasn't using his? Do you think that made a difference in how you were treated?
I mean, I don't know in our individual circumstance, but it's definitely a potential factor. And I do think, seeing members of my community come through the process now, often there's a lot of hope, excitement about the process. And I say not to stereotype, but then, if you're looking at that as a route compared to maybe a cis heterosexual couple through male factor infertility that are having to use a donor sperm, that yes, they both still end up hopefully with beautiful kids through donor conception, but that path is very different depending on that family setup and the sort of whether there's been infertility involved. So yeah, 100%, Sarah. I do think it can vary, and it can mean that the levels of support are different. But equally, I think even for the LGBTQ plus community, yes, the kind of maybe there isn't the infertility as such medically, but you're still having to make decisions around the fact that only one of the partners will be genetically related to the child, or maybe one will carry the pregnancy, or if there's a surrogate involved, so there's lots of other things that make that process still quite emotionally complex, regardless of family type.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be that kind of there's that difference in care and support. Yeah. Or those assumptions being made. That's why I just wondered if you thought it was maybe down to that, but maybe that's another thing for people to consider when they are going, sort of not only the support and counselling that's on offer, but does that differ? And would you still get this if you are in a similar situation to you and, it's a same-sex couple going through treatment, that you still get those same levels of support, same opportunity to talk through some of the concerns you have or some of the decisions you're making and acceptance of some of those decisions as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hopefully, like if they're, depending on where you have treatment as well, they may have certain counsellors, and you may be able to sort of request a counsellor that maybe has more of a specialist interest in, the route that you're going down. So there are things that can maybe inquire about, but again, it's just whether or not, like I say, a lot of clinics, you maybe just have one implications counselling session, and in that, I do sympathise with the professionals because they have a bit of a tick box that they have to go through, like the kind of the importance of disclosure to the child, all of these things that are set out by the HFEA that they have to cover, and then it doesn't leave a lot of time to kind of cover some of the other things that we've discussed. So it's really tricky to kind of get everything in, really. Yeah,
and maybe that's more of a strategy thing. I do think, because I've heard from so many people that almost those, the kind of the grieving side of things and those having to make decisions and acceptance isn't always covered because if they don't have the time, and it is so focused on disclosure. The problem is so many people get to that point and can't believe that they will end up with a child because they've gone through so long of not believing it will happen, it's very difficult then to believe that you will even have a child, never mind deciding about disclosure. So I think maybe it's a bigger thing around making sure there's the time for discussions around that grieving process, around the acceptance and some of the other challenges, isn't it, that people maybe have, because it's so different for everybody going through this journey.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like that's some of the work that we try to do on Paths to Parenthood actually is a community platform where people can speak with other people that are either going through the process at the same time or people that are a lot further ahead. And we have recorded kind of conversations with people, because like you say, things like the genetic loss, you know, I know, like speaking to my colleague Becky, she certainly went through that, having POI, you know, knowing that at quite a young age really, but trying to get her head around the fact that she would have to potentially go on to using donor eggs, and it's not an overnight decision. And I think sometimes in the medical setting, donor treatment can sometimes be just sort of put forward, oh right, well we'll just try donor eggs, or we'll just try donor sperm. Well, yeah, medically that might just be another option, but in your head and emotionally and everything else, it's a whole other route to parenthood, and it's not always given the space, I think, within clinical settings to kind of understand that.
Yeah, definitely. I spoke to one patient in my support groups who said, she was basically said, oh, there's no point even trying with your own eggs. Take this leaflet on donor eggs, read it and come back to us when you've made a decision. And she was like,
it's so common. That process is so common. Yeah, have a leaflet, go and have a read. And of course, like, I mean, there's no support there at all, is it? And it's, yeah, and it may be that at that point it's quite a shock, you know, that you've been told, actually, we're at this point now. And like I say, if you've never really known anybody that's used donor conception or have never really considered it, it's a lot to take in without the support there.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of your journey then, is there anything else you think would have been helpful or that you would have liked while you were going through sort of treatment? I know you've spoken a bit about kind of the more inclusion in the clinics and more sort of inclusive forms and more inclusion in terms of your journey rather than just a stereotypical IVF journey for heterosexual couples, and kind of around kind of the support in making those decisions. But is there anything else that you wish that you'd had that would have made it easier?
I think looking back, we were quite blind going into the process. Like, we didn't really do much research around clinic options, donor choice, for example. I mentioned around certain sperm banks. And I think one of the key things I would say, doing the work I do now, and not only in the support area of donor conception, but with advocacy work there, not all sperm and egg banks are made equal in terms of the way that they treat their donors. And actually, you know, on the flip side, because essentially the children that are born through donation are going to grow up into adults, and like I say, it's making sure that the donor that you choose has kind of gone through the process and had, like I say, screening and counselling, so that, you know, any future child is kind of protected in a way. And like I say, even in the UK, where we are regulated by the HFEA, we are seeing more and more, particularly donor sperm, but increasingly donor eggs being imported from overseas to be used for treatment in the UK, which in itself is great for accessibility. But people need to be made aware of the implications of that. So things like family limits and things like that. So in terms of that information, that would have been incredibly helpful to my wife and I when it came to the decision-making stage, because that information was completely absent when we went through the process, which is improving now, but it's still not great, and it's not consistent across clinics either.
Yeah, and I guess when people are going on this journey, you know, when it's same-sex couples looking to go, there's been so much in the news about kind of unregulated donors, sperm, or people, you know, sperm donors who are unregulated, that understanding around those safety things that, you know, going through a clinic gives you or a sperm bank that's regulated gives you the reassurances that they've had the screening, that they are in line with those family limits, that they, you know, they've had the necessary testing and things like that. Is there anything people can do to protect themselves if they're looking to start their journey and looking at the different options? Because obviously IVF is a really expensive process, and it's really overwhelming when you get started. And there'll be a lot of people who start the journey looking at at ways that they can keep the cost down without it costing so much money. But I can't get my words out. What advice would you give on people who are starting their journey, just in terms of making sure that you're safe in the routes that you take, that you're not, sort of doing at-home insemination with unregulated sperm, things like that? Are there things that are really important to be considering?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, and we could probably do a whole chat on the unregulated sector in itself. But I think I think myself and my wife are in a privileged position that we could afford one round of IVF, and that's literally, and that's because my in-laws gifted us the money, and that was it. And back then it was a lot cheaper to do IVF through donor sperm compared to what it is now. I mean, the prices have rocketed. So I do really sympathize with people who do consider the unregulated space, because a lot of people just financially cannot afford treatment. And like I say, if you haven't technically got any infertility issues, you essentially just need sperm. It can seem as an option for you. There's also reasons of what people don't want to go through the medical process. There's lots of reasons people use the unregulated space. But what I would say is just do your homework and research around some of the implications of doing so. So yes, it may be that you connect with a donor online who you get to know and you feel confident that, everything they're telling you is the truth. But equally, that they're not going through the screening, they're not going through the counselling, they're not going to be registered with the HFEA. So your children won't get that information when they're 18. Appreciate that you may kind of know this person, but that isn't always the case, and sadly people lie. So I would just say look at your options and just kind of weigh it up and potentially get some legal advice on that side of it. But it's really complex, and even in the regulated space, like I've mentioned, not all sperm and egg banks or clinics for that matter do things the same way. So just like I say, look on their websites, look at the things they're offering, look at the costs, and just see what's kind of what's important to you. But yeah, making sure you keep yourself safe is really important, and also the safety of your kind of unborn child as well is also something to consider.
Yeah, like you say, just because you know somebody now doesn't necessarily mean they've told the truth, or that you'll still know them or still have that same relationship
or contact. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it leads really nice on kind of it is about that keeping safe and using safe information as well, finding safe information online, find regulated and sort of approved information, which kind of leads us on to like paths to parenthood and the support that you offer as well. So it's amazing that you're doing this, because there wasn't anything like that beforehand, was there? And do you want to talk through a bit about, I know you've mentioned it briefly at the start, the work that you do at Paths to Parenthood and the support it offers and what people can access through it?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So like I say, I can't take credit for setting it up with the amazing idea. That was Becky, but I'm now co-director of the hub and head of operations, so really heavily involved in it. It's an absolute passion of mine, and it's an amazing privilege to work with people going through the process and now parenting. But essentially, we've been going now for 6 years, and we provide an online support platform, mostly online, although we do host in-person events. And like I say, we just provide content and support for people that are using donor conception, and we literally have covered every single topic. So we've talked about genetic loss, we've got chats about that on the hub, but what we also try to do is, as well as bringing the lived experience, so people sharing their stories, we bring professionals on board, perinatal psychologists, child psychologists, all of these other wonderful highly qualified people to talk about some of those subjects. And like going back to the information as well, so that the thing around like the sperm banks, we have lots of information around things to ask a sperm or egg bank, for example, questions that you might not think to ask, that the responses or lack of responses will be quite informative to you when you're making decisions. So, and the idea behind it is that it's got all of this information, but it's also accessible to people on their smartphone or on their desktop, and we also allow people to connect with one another, either like through like a messaging thing, which is private, or in monthly connection and support calls that we host over Zoom. So yeah, that's a little bit about, like I say, the hub, and like I say, we've been going for 6 years now. So
oh, and you mentioned the lovely Becky as well, and I have got an interview with her that I did a few years ago explaining setting up the hub as well. So if anybody wants to see that, you can go and find that as well. And yeah, I think like all that information and the questions is so important. It's like you said, when you started off, you don't have any idea. I mean, when we started IVF, we didn't know anybody who'd even struggled, and we didn't know the sort of things we should be asking. And we were the same. We went through our local clinic and they were amazing, but you just don't know what you don't know. And I think having that information there is really key, isn't it? Knowing the things to ask so that you can make informed decisions and you're empowered with that information. And also you were mentioning about kind of that peer support. I think that's really important for people going through treatment, isn't it? If you don't know anybody outside your circle or inside your circle and who struggled or is going through, you know, using a donor, it can be really difficult, can't it? And having that peer support where it's non-judgmental and people who really get it is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is a key part of the platform is the peer-to-peer connection. And like I say, many people join for lots of different reasons. Like we've got a huge solo parent community and solo intended parent community, and that's one of the growing areas. Whether you're, you know, in a mum and a dad family through egg donation, 2 mum families, you know, we've got lots of people together with the shared experience of donor conception. But I think that as the platform has grown, there's whether, you know, when we have new people join, we know there's people within the community that will mirror the kind of experiences and the questions that the new people coming in. So it's really helped. And like I say, we've still got members that are with us that have been with us from the start. And like I say, Becky and I have got kids that are kind of approaching that pre-teen kind of tween age. So and it's been really helpful, like even just to kind of speak to other people in the community if you've got questions and things like that. You've got that support there. So.
Yeah, because I guess actually it's not just about making those decisions, is it? About donor and sort of navigating the whole the donor selection and the donor process. That support can continue as that child grows in terms of having those conversations, in terms of when they reach, even to the point where they reach the age where they can find out information about their donor. It's not just for those immediate decisions, is it? And going through that process, and that community almost becomes a support community as that child gets older, and having the conversations with them as they're growing up, if that's what you are choosing to do, and making those decisions about how much you share with them and when you share with them. So it's a continuously growing community, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, and different time points have different kind of things that come up. Like, you know, obviously going through the trying to conceive stage, understandably, is very intensive, lots of emotions, lots of decisions to be made, and that peer support, that's where that becomes very, very helpful. But then, you know, people hopefully go on to have their amazing kids. And then, you know, some people, like, parenting takes over, you know, the groups. And I know that can be really difficult for someone if you're listening to this and you're right at the beginning stage. But, you know, things change and adapt, and you sort of settle into parenting. But then actually your child may get to the sort of, they start talking and they start understanding more. And you think, oh, okay, I'm really going to have to start potentially introducing the concept of how they came into this world soon, and what language we're going to use, what do we say, how do we, you know, maybe if you're starting to, if you haven't already, talk with family members, because maybe you haven't told family members that you've used a donor to help have your family, and you're considering, right, okay, we're going to start talking to my child. So what I'm saying is there's so many things, and that's what's so great about the platform, is that we've got that support across the kind of lifespan almost of the family, all the way from trying to conceive all the way through to parenting.
Yeah, and I know that is difficult when you're still on your journey to conceive and you haven't, you know, had that positive test, you haven't had the baby. But I think even some of those conversations can be really helpful, because they're concerns for people when they're looking and making decisions about using a donor, about how I'll do that in the future, and the worries about the relationships. I know it's something Becky talks a lot about. She shares a lot about that, about the worry about the relationship she would have and how she would feel and things. And I think those journeys further on will be really helpful for people who are trying to make those decisions on donors, won't they? That actually some of those worries aren't something that manifest themselves, because, you know, I think you probably spiral when you're thinking about some of these things and the loss of genetics. But actually, when you can see other stories about people still having these amazing relationships with their child, even though they have been conceived using a donor, I think that can be really helpful for people, can't it, that's still on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, Julianne Bouteleb, who's one of our amazing perinatal psychologists, always says, if you can see it, you can be it. And I 100% agree with that. And again, like, just like, for example, we held a webinar last night, and the topic was around the decision from going from your own eggs to donor eggs, and what that can be, both the medical process, but also the emotional process. And one of the attendees last night actually wrote a really kind of heartfelt message in the question box, and was just really struggling with I just can't get past how I'm going to have these conversations. The medical treatment, she kind of accepted that she was going to need to use donor eggs. Her husband was on board. She'd spoken to her family, but she was petrified about the years ahead, not about kind of selecting a donor or anything like that, but just worrying about the future. And that's where, like you say, that those topics, which is we try to kind of support people by providing information and content that covers those topics, just to show a bit of reassurance. And actually, this is how you could potentially start a conversation. You can use storybooks, and we provide actual tangible things that people can do, and that even helps people, like you say, in the trying to conceive stage almost as well.
Yeah. So it's so valuable, isn't it, at all stages, because it's that lifeline. And I think peer group support is so important. I think there's so little support and understanding in a wider community around struggling to get pregnant, around going through IVF, around using donors, that having people who totally get it is where you get that no judgment. You can be totally honest. You can really ask the questions that you need to ask. And I think having any type of support like that is really important. Yeah.
And like you say, there's not a lot of it out there. And I think certainly when it's very tailored when it comes to donor conception, because I've been part of many over the years, kind of general IVF spaces or maybe general fertility spaces. But I think donor conception is there's another layer to it, that often that need isn't met in those more generalized spaces. So yeah, hopefully we're doing our bit to fill that gap, as it were.
You're doing a massive bit to help with that. And yeah, that's something I speak to people about, and they say they're just normal trying to conceive or IVF groups just don't have it is that added level of grief and decision making and acceptance that they then don't feel like they belong in traditional IVF groups. So having that space where it is something specific to you is so important. So how can people find out about Paths to Parenthood then?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So we've got our website, which is pathstoparenthood.com. There's a bit of a tongue tie there, but if you go onto our main site, there's all details of the membership. We've also got a free resources section with loads of free content. And I mentioned earlier in the conversation around top questions to ask your egg and sperm bank. That's a freely accessible document on there. You can go on and just give you some tips if that's what you're at that sort of stage of decision making. We also have the podcast, again, Paths to Parenthood podcast, on our 4th or 5th season now. Loads of lived experience stories, loads of professional insight, and just general conversations around donor conception. So you can check it out there. It is a paid for platform, but membership starts at 16 quid a month. And excitingly, which is what we've tried to do over the last few years, is partner with a number of clinics and sperm and egg banks that actually provide our access to our platform free of charge as part of the treatment process, which is amazing, because it means that the cost of the membership, even small, is kind of is one thing you don't have to worry about paying for, as it were. So definitely ask if you are having treatment in the UK, if Paths to Parenthood's included, because we're, like I say, in more and more clinics now as the years are going on. So,
which is amazing, isn't it? So yeah, definitely check if it's part of your clinic resources. And it's brilliant having those free resources as a starting point as well. So definitely worth people checking that out. And then just before we finish, just what advice would you give to somebody if they're starting on their journey? What would be the one thing that you'd say would be really helpful as a starting point if they don't feel a little bit overwhelmed about getting going?
I would just say feeling overwhelmed is totally normal. I think that is just part of the process, sadly. But I think just making small steps. I think I've always found it helpful when I've spoken to people with donor conception. A word that comes up a lot is like the fears around donor conception. So I would just say to someone, look, if that's something that, if you are worried about it, is jot down what some of those fears are. So whether it's talking to your child, talking to friends and family, you're worried about how you're going to choose a donor, just get them down on a bit of paper in black and white, and then kind of work through them around how you might kind of work through some of those fears. So listening to people on podcasts and things like that, would that be helpful? That might help with one of the fears around, what my future family look like. And just try and work through it in stages, as opposed to kind of going at it is one big massive kind of information, because like I say, it is going to be overwhelming. So just trying to approach it in a bit more of a strategic way would be my advice.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I lost you for a little bit, froze for a second, but I think the gist of writing those fears down and working through them, finding out where you can get that information or who you can speak to help with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just get it. I think for me personally, I always find it easier getting it written down so it's in black and white, and then drawing a big line through it. It's quite satisfying when you've been able to kind of answer some of those questions, just so you can approach things in a bit more of a strategic way.
Well, I think it just having that information just makes you feel more in control, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it just means that you can then make decisions based on all that information. You're not going in blind. So thank you so much. That's been so helpful. It's been really insightful for me as well, having these conversations. So thank you so much for the work you're doing, but also for sharing your story today as well.
Well, thank you for having me on, Sarah. I've really enjoyed our chat. So.
All right. So thank you, and take care, and check out Paths to Parenthood, because, you know, there's the membership there, but there's also the free resources, which are invaluable as well. So thank you so much.
No problem. Take care.
You too.